Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited to have you here. We got off a slightly delayed start, some technical issues, and I think it's very indicative of this world that we're living in now, where we're trying to do things from home and different Wi-Fi's and what have you. So thank you so much for your patience. And this is recorded and will be sent out to those participants who might have missed it. I'd like to start off with an acknowledgement of country, and then I will properly introduce everyone that's on the call today. So, the custom of acknowledging and paying respect to country has been carried out in Australia for tens of thousands of years. I would like us all to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners of Eora Nation, where I am located, and pay my respects to the ancestors, elders, and country of the Gadigal and Bidjigal people. Others of us are on the call from ancestral territories of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples of Canada. So I would also like to acknowledge these peoples and their territories and ask us all to reflect on how we have benefited from their continued care and custodianship of these territories. The CACC believes it is important for us to understand that our living and working on Indigenous lands places a significant burden on country and on its custodians, and for all of us to try and lessen that burden as much as we can. But I'd like to introduce the guests formally, and then we'll get into the keynote address and a moderated discussion. So Francois Geru, for the sake of this conversation, shall we call you Andre? Is that all right? Would you prefer to go first name only? Okay, great. So, I mean, Andre, you have a quite extensive employment history. You've been all over the world. I don't want to reread the bios because everyone who has joined would have read them, and they're all really impressive. But I do want to make mention that you did join in your current role during the pandemic. So you did arrive in Australia, I want to say mid-2020. So I just want to acknowledge that, because that, for anybody in the midst of a worldwide pandemic to go to a foreign country and be in the role that you're in, I think is quite remarkable. So thank you for joining. Josh Riley, based in Toronto. Josh, similarly, you have now gone over to Canada, and you've been there for how long now?
4 whole weeks, Mel.
4 weeks, right? Okay, so you were what Andre was doing last year, again in a very similar role. I again am quite impressed with your vast experience. And I think it's amazing what you're going to be doing in your role over there, given these uncertain times. I think the reason why everyone here has been chosen is because we are in a pandemic. And so each of your roles, taking this progressive leadership during a time of uncertainty is nothing short of remarkable. So I'm really happy that you're able to join us today. So thank you so much. And then Stella from Indigenous Business Australia. She's based in Canberra. So thank you for joining, Stella. We haven't had the opportunity to work together, and I'm really excited on the partnership CACC is forging with the IBA. You have a long history within this space, so we're really keen to hear what you have to say around what we should be looking at when it comes to leading inclusive trade and leading people to take a different thinking maybe than what we did pre-pandemic. And finally, last but not least, Richard, based in Ottawa. Thank you, Richard, for joining from Export Development Canada, a close partner of ours. And similarly, you're in a newer role. You were appointed the Chief Diversity Officer there, I believe it was July of this year, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a new role for EDC, is it not?
Well, yes, it is.
Yeah. So you'll be forging a path. So we've got four individuals here that are forging their own path in really important areas. So thank you so much for joining. I'd like to start off with Francois Geru, Consul General for Canada in Sydney, to give your remarks.
Bonjour, everyone. What an honor to be here today. I am pleased to speak to you also from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. First, I would like to say a special thank you to you, Mel, and the whole CACC team for organizing this amazing program. I feel both honored and privileged to have been invited to say a few words. As you all know, Canada's link to Australia are long and storied, and I'll just mention one because I think it's quite a significant one. It was in 1895 that John Lark arrived in Sydney to become Canada's first trade commissioner anywhere in the world, making Sydney's Canada's oldest trading post. 126 years of direct engagement. So it is with a lot of modesty that I follow the steps of my predecessor. I arrived, as you mentioned, Mel, just a little bit more than a year ago, directly from our nation capital city, Ottawa. Before that, I had the honor to represent Canada in New York City, at the UN, in Paris at our bilateral embassy, and in Copenhagen as ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, where I had the pleasure to meet one of your fellow Australians, Princess Mary, the future Queen of Denmark. But during every one of those assignments, I always cherished the many professional and personal relationships that I developed with my Australian counterparts. Your fellow mates educated me about the rivalry between Sydney and Melbourne, not dissimilar to what we have between Toronto and Montreal, and I will spare you the comments about Canberra, which is very similar to Ottawa. Canada and Australia, similar yet different. The list is long, but does include our Indigenous heritage and Commonwealth linkages, our multicultural present, our love for contact sports and beer, our shared experience of extreme temperature, although at very opposite ends. Not surprisingly, every day I am amazed by the depth of our relations in every aspect of life, government to government, business to business, and people to people. And every day I am also amazed at all the ways we are connecting and by the opportunities to do more. Just recently, this past July, 55 Aussie firefighters were deployed to Canada for several weeks to help us battle the devastating wildfires in BC and Ontario. Last year, it was the other way around, when Canadian fire experts came here to help with the horrific bushfires. In time of need, we know we can count on each other. So as Consul General of Canada, my focus is very simple: amplify this amazing reality. Canada, Australia have been and are more than ever natural partners. This is why I like to describe Canada-Australia relations today as redefining mateship. So as you know, mateship is an Australian cultural idiom that embodies equality, loyalty, and friendship. If that doesn't describe Canada and Australia, what does? Because at the heart of mateship, there are the shared values and principles that unite us today: a shared belief in democracy, the rule of law, gender equality, diversity, and Indigenous rights, and the principle of open and transparent market economies. In a nutshell, a rule-based international order. And for Canada and Australia, this is not a nice to have. It is an extension of our national fabric, a common platform for us to implement better policies for better lives at home and globally. But neither of us can do it alone. Our success rests in our ability to join forces for our collective security, prosperity, and well-being. These shared values and principles guide us in responding to the emerging global issues of the new world we live in. As international trade practitioners, you will be mindful of these current challenges, from the new digital landscape to pandemic response and caused by climate change to rising autocracy and threats to democracy. This new world is facing a complex set of interconnected challenges and issues. And as international business people, you understand and often feel firsthand the importance of a peaceful, stable, and safe trading environment. Effective international cooperation and courageous values-based leadership are crucial to creating and maintaining this rules-based trading environment. And this is where Australia-Canada, as mates, we can thrive. And while I mentioned we share many common interests and challenges, today I will focus on the 4 C's, which define well the new world we live in. So the 4 C's is the COVID recovery, the rise of China and the Indo-Pacific, climate change, and cybersecurity. In all of these C's, the track record of Canada-Australia cooperation is impressive, and the business opportunities are as numerous. COVID-19 recovery. Well, we all know it's been an incredibly challenging 18 months globally. I think we can all agree that we are quite lucky to be here or in Canada. Despite all the disruptions that the pandemic has brought, our respective governments continue to prioritize effort to help us through it and are fully mobilized to ensure a smooth recovery. The recovery offers many opportunities to reset policies and practices in favor of more sustainable growth that leaves no one behind. As we strive to build back better, opportunities to do more exist together. As trading nations, Canada and Australia rely on open and transparent market economy principles and a rule-based international system. These are essential to level the playing field for international trade and maintaining open and connected supply chains. As mate nations, we are working together to resist protectionism and economic nationalism. As mate nations, we believe in open, competitive markets that can ensure free and inclusive trade so that you can compete and flourish. As mate nations, we are also putting in place inclusive trade policies to ensure that our traditionally underrepresented groups, such as women entrepreneurs and Indigenous peoples, are able to share in the benefit of international trade and investment. We believe in diversity and are both committed to mainstream these values in everything we do, international trade included. We do this through our shared memberships in the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the G20, APEC, and the WTO, to name a few. So, unfortunately, the new world we live in, nothing can be taken for granted, which makes me moving to my second C, China and the Indo-Pacific. China undoubtedly has become a major economic and political power. Unfortunately, some of China's action and specific practices of recent years have strained our bilateral relations for both Canada and Australia. A strong rules-based trading system remains Canada and Australia's best guard against the use of coercive diplomacy practices. For this, we need a reformed, well-functioning WTO, and Canada and Australia have been working closely together to lead this effort. Our cooperation within the Ottawa Group on WTO reform has been key to its success and highly celebrated. Similarly, the alarming practice of arbitrary detention has also characterized our respective relations with China. For Canada, it was the two Michaels, two men working in China who were arbitrarily detained for more than 1,000 days for the only reason of being Canadian. In response to these appalling actions, Canada launched earlier this year the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations. We did this to demonstrate global opposition to the practice of arbitrary arrest, detention, and sentencing of foreign nationals for diplomatic leverage. The declaration is now endorsed by more than 1/3 of the world's countries. Australia is among the partners most supportive to move quickly and decisively on this issue. So thank you very much for that. These two examples show the importance of joint concerted efforts to guard against coercive practices and reassert our shared values and principles. It is with that in mind that Canada welcomed the recent announcement of the new trilateral security partnership known as AUKUS. AUKUS will deepen security collaboration between Australia, the UK, and the US in the Indo-Pacific, with at its center Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. Canada, like Australia, understands the importance of turning words into action and building strategic partnership based on shared values. The extremely close cooperation that has characterized the Five Eyes partners, Canada, Australia, US, UK, and New Zealand, these past decades, and the trust that was developed through it, paved the way to this important development. So Canada is very supportive of Australia's leadership in the region, and we are very much looking forward to our continuous engagement with you, the other Five Eyes partners and regional allies, for a peaceful, stable, and safe Indo-Pacific, which is key for our respective prosperity. The third C, climate change and net zero. For Canadians and Australians, when it comes to net zero, the challenges are real. Vast lands, extreme weather, dispersed populations, energy-intense industries. But so are the opportunities, abundance of renewable energy sources and primary resources, resilient workers, innovation leaders. Many of you would have visited or worked in each country and know the similarities between Canada and Australia firsthand, be they geographic, cultural, or industrial. The reasons to learn from each other, cooperate, share technologies, and put our best minds together to turn these challenges into opportunities are as numerous. Canada's High Commissioner to Australia, His Excellency Mark Glauser, will be addressing this summit on this exact subject. So please make sure to tune in for his remark during session 3 tomorrow. My last C, cybersecurity. As business leaders and practitioner, you know that the challenge of cybersecurity has never been harder. You have to take action to protect your critical information, be it personal or business sensitive. Technology is changing very, very fast, and it is also changing the way we live and work and impacting social, economic, and security relations. Develop the digital dimension of the rule-based international order we all critically depend on. It is our shared values of liberal democracies and inclusive societies that will guide us and help us succeed. And the list goes on and on. As international business practitioner, you probably have your own list, and I bet it embodies the qualities of mateship: equality, loyalty, and friendship. Add to this a strong sense of purpose based on shared values and principles, and you have the New World definition of mateship: Australia, Canada. Please do not hesitate to reach out. We want to connect even more. So wishing you a great summit. Merci. Thank you.
I really loved the Mate Nations. I hadn't heard that before, but I feel as though, I mean, Josh, I obviously met you before you went over, and I've always felt that there is this mateship between Australia and Canada. I haven't had the pleasure to meet Stella face to face. It's always been in this virtual world, as with Richard being so far away, but I definitely think we can all agree that we have this mate nation. So I really love that. Thank you for your remarks. I think it was really important of what you conveyed. I know that you may not be able to stay the whole time. I think you have to dip off. So I do thank you so much for participating and kicking off what is hopefully an annual trade summit to talk about the issues between Australia and Canada, which I think is a very important relationship. So I'm going to turn to Josh, Josh Riley over in Toronto. Josh, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Mel. Bonjour and hello all. As a proud descendant of the Wiradjuri people of central New South Wales, I'd like to importantly begin by paying my deepest respects to the traditional owners of the lands from which everyone is joining. As I'm in Toronto, the land I'm joining you from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I'd also like to thank my counterpart Andre for his remarks. Having recently commenced in my role, I look forward to continuing the collaboration between our two countries' foreign affairs, trade, and investment functions. I'd also like to thank Mel and the CACC team for coordinating and hosting this summit, and I look forward to the collaboration with your team, your board, and your members. So, as you might know, this is my second time in Toronto and Canada. I'm genuinely thrilled to be back in Canada for so many reasons. But what excites me the most is that my job focuses on something that I'm a big believer in: the potential of the Australia-Canada relationship. Like all good relationships, ours is grounded in many things that we both have in common, which Andre outlined so well. So I'll just cut to the chase and agree that our two nations really are good mates. An important part of being good mates is that we help each other out. At the beginning of last year, I had the opportunity to meet Canadian and Australian firefighters who worked alongside each other during Australia's devastating bushfires, an inspiring example of mateship in action. In particular, I think we fall into a special category of mateship where we don't just enjoy one another's company, we don't just support one another, but we also do a great job when we work together. Recent examples include the Canadian Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Association and the Australian Hydrogen Council signing an MOU last year focused on collaboration on commercial zero-emission hydrogen and fuel cells. And METS Ignited, an Australian mining technology consortium, signing an MOU with Canada's Centre of Excellence for Mining Innovation. When it comes to the macroeconomic data, two-way trade between Australia and Canada was valued at 6.4 billion Australian dollars, with about 3/4 of this being merchandise trade, and the final quarter, of course, being services. While this is a notable outcome in pandemic times, in 2019, our two-way trade was 8.4 billion, so we've experienced a decrease of almost a quarter since the pandemic hit both our shores, with services being the most affected. As countries whose prosperity is tied to international trade, it is certainly important that we work together to grow the trade we do with one another. With Canada being a priority market for Australia, we have recently focused more staff on connecting Australian exporters with Canadian importers, particularly in agri-food, infrastructure, resources, and new energy. Upon commencing in my role, I was pleased to hear the team report that we are seeing a marked increase in Australian companies interested in Canada across a range of sectors. Despite challenging times in global trade, we are seeing Australian companies in Canada and continue to expand and enjoy success. One sector we see a lot of opportunity in is agri-food. As part of the Australian government's $72.7 million Agribusiness Expansion Initiative, or ABI, we are working to help Australian agribusinesses expand into new markets, with Canada being a priority under ABI. Effective September 2021, we now have in-market representation driving this work on the ground, with a current focus on beef, seafood, horticultural products, packaged goods, and wine. For anyone joining from the agri-food sector, I encourage you to keep an eye out for us at key upcoming events like Restaurants Canada Show in Toronto, BC Seafood Expo in Vancouver, CACC Montreal, and Meat Expo Toronto. When it comes to expanding as an exporter, I believe our countries have much that we can offer one another, including beyond our immediate markets. Given our many similarities, Canada is a great gateway for Australian exporters with ambitions to succeed in North America broadly. Likewise, Australia is a great base for Canadian companies looking to expand across Asia-Pacific, and we see many Canadian companies look to Australia to set up a regional headquarters. This is the important linkage between outward investment and trade. While trade declined significantly from 2019 to 20 due to the pandemic, investment in both countries increased. In 2020, the level of Canadian investment in Australia reached 65 billion Australian dollars, which represents about 3.3% of Australian GDP. This was 8.4% more than in 2019, which is a remarkable outcome during a very challenging year. Australia is the 5th largest destination for Canadian direct investment abroad and the largest destination in Asia and Oceania. Canadian investment into Australia grew at an average rate of 13% annually over the last decade, covering a broad range of industries, including infrastructure, resources, new energy, health, digitech, agri-food, and advanced manufacturing. As we work to grow trade and investment between our two countries, we must be inclusive in our approach. As the first Indigenous Australian appointed as Consul General and Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner in Canada, I'm also proud that, in 2019, Australia's first Indigenous business-focused trade mission was to Toronto and Vancouver, where the mission met with our delegation to the World Indigenous Business Forum. This was Australia's largest delegation to Canada on record. This underscores the opportunity our nations have to ensure our first traders are well represented in our trade and investment flows. Before departing Australia, I had the privilege of chairing a dialogue between Indigenous business leaders as part of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Businesses virtual export mission to Australia. I'm pleased to say that this was well supported by the Australian and Canadian governments, along with Supply Nation and the Australia-Canada Indigenous Economic Partnership. Continuing to collaborate with these stakeholders to grow Indigenous participation in trade and investment will be an important focus during my posting. This not only aligns with the mutual values of our two nations, but is also essential to realise our full potential on the world stage. As we move into our first session, I'd like to welcome you to reach out to my team who work nationally from our presences in Toronto and Vancouver to explore how we may assist you with your ambitions in trade or investment. I also want to extend my apologies that I have to leave after giving these remarks due to some existing commitments, but in departing, I'd also like to say thank you, merci, miigwech.
Thank you so much, Josh. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to represent Australia, and it's lovely to hear from both Andre and yourself. I'm sure you'll be working very closely together. And I know that you've just obviously landed in Canada not that long ago, so I'm really looking forward to working with you over your appointment. And I wish you all the best, especially coming into a very cold Canadian winter. Hopefully we'll have you back at the next summit. So congratulations and thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me, Mel.
Thanks, Josh. Okay, so I think we're going to get into a moderated conversation. So Stella and Richard, I'll probably ask for you to unmute, because what I'd like to achieve is a conversation. And I think it's, this is called Leading Through a Pandemic. Not only do you work for organizations that are pretty critical in what you do in your respective areas, but you as individuals and professionals have a long history within your community and what you represent. So I'd love to start off just by hearing about your personal story of how you came into the role that you're in today. You know, what drives you, your passion for what you do, and also, you know, maybe some experiences along the way that you think would be relevant to, you know, where we find ourselves today and why inclusivity and diversity is so important. Stella, did ladies first, shall I say? Can I start with you first to share your story, what you're comfortable with sharing?
Sure, thanks, Mel. I'll just begin by acknowledging, as we do, the traditional owners of lands on which we are all living and working. I'm here in Canberra on beautiful Untitled Country, so I pay my respects as the custodians of this land. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present, and to their emerging leaders. I'd also like to pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the First Nations people in Canada. I pay my respect to their ancestors, their elders, and to their emerging leaders as well. So I'm really pleased to join the panel today. I'm always happy to share what IBA does and to share what, you know, my knowledge and my experience with the Indigenous business sector within Australia, and, you know, how it's grown significantly and the significant contribution it makes to economic empowerment for our people and intergenerational change. I'm an Aranda woman, so my family are from the Central Desert in South Australia. I grew up in Canberra here, though. I have had a business, so soon after I got married, I bought my first business with my husband, and we ran it for 8 years. It was a food shop, so it was takeaway foods. We worked, you know, 12 and 16 hours a day for most of that 8 years. It was one of the most complex times, I think, of my life. I think in, you know, being in your community, trying to establish a presence, trying to establish a foundation for your family. But as one of the most complex times, it was one of the most rewarding times, because it really did build a foundation for my family. I was able to contribute to my local community. And it really, I think, in fact, created the pathway that led me here to IBA. When I finished and sold my business, I joined a Commonwealth company called Aboriginal Hostels. And so for me, when I sold my business, I knew it was time for me to focus on, more broadly, my communities, thinking about the empowerment that I'd had and coming from the change of my childhood. I really wanted to be able to contribute that to other Aboriginal people. And so I joined Aboriginal hostels, I worked with a diverse range of people. They had Aboriginal hostels, for those who don't know, provide temporary accommodation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across Australia. And I was there for 9 years and really learnt so much more about the diverse cultures across Australia. Not only my own in being able to spend more time sort of with family and on country, but more broadly of the different factors and the diversity that are Aboriginal cultures and Torres Strait Islander cultures. It grew to a point in time where it's really important to have safe surrounds and culturally appropriate surrounds. But I did a leadership program with IBA, and it really it caught my eye, the focus on economic empowerment and self-determination. And this was all done through home ownership and investment and through business. And it was very much a space that I hadn't necessarily been in through my career, or even grown up in a space of thinking about economic empowerment, being able to be independent and financially sound and safe. So I was fortunate enough to apply for a job at IBA and come over on secondment. And actually just spend time in the business program. I came over at a time when the Indigenous procurement policy, so that's the federal government's policy, was first launched. So was really fortunate to be able to assist Indigenous businesses to understand opportunities through procurement and through government, and being able to assist businesses into some of those opportunities as well. When I came to IBA, the language of business was quite different. It's not a language that I'd used in my own business. As a small community-based business, it was smart, it was sophisticated, and it was really empowering, and it really changed my thinking of what really could be more broadly for our people. So now I've been with IBA for 5 years. I'm fortunate enough to have led the Business Solutions program, which focuses on business finance and capability development. And in my role now, I work with our 3 program areas and really focus on our community and customer experience. I'll tell you a little bit about IBA for those that don't know us. So we're a Commonwealth statutory authority. We were established to assist in the economic independence of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and it really is at the heart of our vision and our programs and what we do. Our drivers are to ensure that First Nation Australians participate and contribute to the broader Australian economy. And that the participation is embedded in our country's culture to ensure that future generations enjoy the strength and diversity and untapped opportunities. We want at IBA for Indigenous Australians to have the same financial opportunities as other Australians, and through our programs we attempt to remove a lot of the obstacles that may prevent our customers and a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from creating wealth and accumulating assets, and fulfilling business aspirations and home ownership aspirations as well. Through our programs, we assist, as I mentioned, Indigenous Australians to buy homes, so first home buyers, purchase and set up businesses. And we also have an investment program where we invest in commercial ventures with traditional owner groups, and we build strong financial returns for them and communities as well. So that's a little bit about me and my journey to IBA, and a little bit about what we do. Inclusivity is so important, just to reflect, Mel, on what you're saying, and the importance of creating a country that respects and appreciates diversity and the First Nations people, and to be able to create that through economic participation and business. Being able to do it through education and good health outcomes is really important. And I think we're seeing a nation change and move towards that space where traditionally through the impacts of colonisation, we as First Nation peoples have been very segregated from society.
Thank you for sharing your story. And I think that thing that really jumped out to me is economic participation. I think that is huge. I think people overlook it, but it's it's probably a lot more complex than what many people think. And I want to get into more about what the IBA is doing, because there's some really exciting things. Whoops, losing my earbuds here. some really exciting things that I'd like to be able to share and have you speak about. But Richard, can you give me a bit of your story? I loved catching up with you in preparation for this summit to learn more about your background. But would you like to share a bit about how, sort of how you've developed your career up until this stage, and then taking on this inaugural role of Chief Diversity Officer for a very large global organization?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm thankful and honored to acknowledge that the EDC head office is located on the traditional unceded territory and homeland of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We had an acknowledgement earlier, but I just wanted to mention from Ottawa, where our head office is located, I'd like to acknowledge. So the first question, we talked about my personal story. And I think I'd like to focus a bit more on that. Like you said, you wanted to have kind of an open dialogue. So I thought about it, and I was wondering, what am I going to say? And I guess I'd like to go back to my roots. I was born in Montreal, Quebec, of a Jamaican father and a German mother. So diversity has always been part of my life. It's really who I am. And my first encounter with racism was when I started kindergarten, and I heard the N-word really for the first time. And I found it to be, quite disturbing. Some of the kids said I was in the oven too long. I'm like, what do you mean? So that kind of threw me off in a big way. And as a young child, it was quite disturbing. Fast forward, graduating from McGill University, I graduated during a recession. There was very, very few job opportunities available. I had the qualifications for one particular job. I went, showed up. And the lady there said, yes, can I help you? And I said, hi, it's Richard Pinnock from McGill University. I'm here for the job interview. And she said, oh, okay. So I'm thinking, okay. So she said, we have this little test. It's 50 questions. You have 12 minutes. It's the Wonderlic Test. It's quite famous. And she said, don't worry about finishing it. Nobody's finished it in the 14 years that I've been here. And you've got 12 minutes. She had one of those old fashioned, timers. So she cranked the timer and she said, you ready? I'm like, yeah, I'm ready. So she said, okay, ready, go. So then I'm starting going through the test. So she said, you had 12 minutes. 11 minutes later, I knock on her door and she looks up. She goes like, what? Like she's wondering, what did I not understand with the instructions? And I said, I'm finished. So she like takes the test, have a seat. So she sits down and I'm sitting there waiting. She comes out and she's like, wow. And she said, you did pretty well. And I said, how did I do? She said, you got 44 out of 50 questions right. And I said, great. But I finished in 11 minutes. I said, what was the highest score you ever got? She said, the highest score I've ever seen was a 45. And I'm like, yes, so this is going to be a job. It was a beautiful day. I'm thinking this is a wonderful way to finish graduating from McGill. And she said, look, I have to tell you honestly, I feel uncomfortable putting you forward for the job. And I'm like, what do you mean? And she said, well, we're a very conservative company here. And I just think that I think I'm going to get in trouble. So to be honest, I'm not going to be putting you forward. So I had one of those sinking feelings, like my heart. And I thought, wow, this is like horrible. And all of my energy, all my aspirations in life and all that kind of, I saw sort of reality like in the face, right? And so I thanked her for her time. I said, thank you very much. And I went outside. I remember it was a sunny day. I remember looking up and I said, I want to do whatever I can do to stop other Canadians from having this experience that I just had today. And that was a long time ago. And it's still what drives me every day. So I'm still doing it as we speak today. I've worked in a variety of volunteer roles. I've worked with minority youth. I work with the Toronto and Halton Police. I've worked with over 5,000 kids on a volunteer basis for leadership skills. Black kids, different minority kids here in Canada, newcomers to Canada, Indigenous kids. I've really devoted my life, both professionally and also privately, to help others reach their God-given full potential. So that's what drives me every day. It's what led me to this role. And 3 months in, I'm very, very excited about the wonderful people at EDC. They're so smart, caring, kind, and we're all focused on doing what is important to me, and that is giving everybody the opportunity to reach their full potential. As I say so often, in Canada, we have so many immigrants, newcomers to Canada with multiple degrees, 2, 3 university degrees, driving taxis and Ubers. And I say it's time to stop driving taxis and Ubers, and it's time to start driving the economy. So that's really my story, and I'm very committed, very passionate about creating new opportunities and new ways for organizations to come together to actually create stronger teams so that we can collectively take care of our customers. That's me.
That's an amazing story, and one that I can relate to from my experience. But it's exciting to hear from both of you that have this very personal connection to what you do for your day job, I guess one could say today. And I think the impact that both of you and your organizations can make with regards to inclusivity and diversity, but in very different ways. I mean, from the Indigenous Business Australia perspective, you're helping them set up their businesses or scale their businesses or get into business. And then Richard, from your organization, it seems like you're leading, a very large global workforce here, and making sure that they're well represented. So one's very outward facing, let's say, and the other more inward facing. So it's really quite fascinating. This question can go to either of you. I mean, feel free to jump in, but have you noticed any trends over the last 20 months since we've been in this pandemic? And welcome back, Andre. Thank you for joining. Have you noticed any trends in the last 20 months in your space? I think, again, like I just said, Richard having a more inward, dealing with a global workforce, and Stella having a more outward of how small business in the Indigenous community may have been affected. I'd be keen to hear and pass on this type of observation to people that are listening today.
Stella, would you like to go?
Yeah, so I'm happy to lead. So we have actually, it's been such a complex 18 months internationally and nationally, and we've seen, the business sector. So in Australia, we've had continual border closes. We sort of get this false sense of security where our borders are open, our businesses are trading, and then we sort of get this shutdown and restriction. And we've had some, pretty large sectors, with a high profile for Indigenous businesses that have been impacted over the pandemic. So our tourism sector and our arts sector, our performing arts sector, and even our construction and activities that happen in regional and remote areas have been impacted significantly. We've seen a significant amount of resilience. So as all First Nations people, resilient and strong and adaptable to change. And it's been no different through the pandemic. We've seen businesses pivot. We've seen businesses look at digital technologies and different ways of expanding their products and services. So we at IBA, we work with a high number of Indigenous businesses and professional services. And, when we work in a way where we refer to an Aboriginal terms of reference. So it's a connected and it's a level of trust. And we do this often in person. And, First Nation peoples of Australia, we like to connect in person. So the pandemic has restricted that connectivity, and we've been very protective of our communities and our old people and our elders, of course, of the pandemic. So what it's done is it's made businesses look at a different way of doing business and think about how technology can help them deliver their services, how they can connect with their customers, how they can connect with their communities. And so we've seen this increase of businesses establishing this digital profile online and actually exploring e-commerce systems and understanding how to sell their products and services online and thinking about it in a totally different way than what you would traditionally as in a face-to-face service, which means that it's the business sector, Indigenous business sector, is thinking more broadly from a national and international perspective, and those doors open more broadly to, well, what can I do with my products and services? And the conversation is really prevalent about selling, online sales overseas. And so we've seen these trends come through where there's the sectors building business profiles online and digitally.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have to take something good out of a pandemic, it's exciting that pivoting has happened in that space. Richard?
Yeah, we've seen similar trends. I think the biggest impact of COVID particularly for some of the communities. I know within the Black community, there's a concentration of businesses in service area, foods, specialty, and a lot of bootstrap financing going on. So these are smaller organizations, and literally with the shutdown, you can't operate. Restaurants are closed and so on. The Black Business Professional Association of the BBPA did a study recently, and they saw that 98% of Black business owners said that they have no more capacity to take on debt during the pandemic compared to 56% of all businesses other than Black. Andre had mentioned earlier about traditionally there's a focus at our inclusive trade focus has been on women and Indigenous communities, but now there's also a really pent-up need to focus on Black community as well. And I've got some thoughts I can maybe share a little bit later on that, but those are the same trends. Also, when you talk about, Stella talked about online and digital. When you're doing barbershops and stuff like that, it's kind of hard to do an online barbershop, right? I started to do my own hair, so I learned that online, but it's a tough business model. And there's a lot of smaller companies, that are not necessarily at the export level. We want to help bring the companies micro and small into that medium segment, and then eventually expand into exporting.
So I think, I mean, we don't have a crystal ball. Obviously, if we did, we would know a pandemic was going to hit us. But is there something that you are seeing or that you foresee that's going to be a real important key driver, like a skill set? I mean, Estelle, you mentioned resilience, which I think everyone could probably have a bit more of that. But is there a key skill set that you think is going to be needed to drive forward? I mean, we've now, one could argue, adjusted to this new normal. I think originally, we were all looking to get back to normal, but I think we've lost that. I think we are now in a new world. I do believe that, and we have other sessions in the summit, we're going to talk about it more extensively. I do believe Australia has experienced a very different pandemic to Canada in the way that we've managed the virus, in the way we've approached lockdowns and whatnot, given that we are in two different regions on the globe. So I'm wondering if there's something that you can impart for people, bringing it back to leadership, either leading their own business or taking a leadership role in an organization. What sort of key skill sets have you potentially identified that is going to be needed for the next few years to really successfully thrive in this environment, rather than just try to make it to the next month or the next week or the next year? Like thrive instead of survive, I suppose.
Yep. Mel, when you talk about leadership, we've seen, so we have some significant Indigenous leaders and business leaders. We have our elders, we have old people, we have established business people, we have young, innovative leaders coming through. And the conversation that we've had prior, and it really started before the pandemic, was leading through business and leading through empowerment and reflective leadership. And, Indigenous Australians we look at ourselves, even in a corporate environment, in a different space now as leaders. There's a different level of empowerment and community connection and being able to work and create results. And so so at IBA, a lot of our focus when we do capability programs, we're focusing on leadership in business and leadership in community. And there are different forms of leadership that we're seeing. Is, for example, when you and I had a chat, Mel, when we first caught up, I was talking to you about reciprocity of connections and networks and sharing opportunities. And that's something that we've seen significantly grow over the last 2 to 3 years, but more so since the pandemic. And the leadership where the Indigenous business sector are seeking opportunity and growing, and not even creating their own supply chains, but creating a collective of businesses to actually provide services and products for a bigger impact and a greater outcomes, a significant level of leadership that we haven't seen before. And that's just, it's something that's really standing out. And so the conversation that we have predominantly now is around Indigenous leadership, leading through business, leading through education, leading through change.
Richard, did you have insight on this?
Stella mentioned part of the Indigenous or Aboriginal culture is this idea of being connected and connectiveness. I think it's really important for leaders to understand that our people are feeling disconnected, and it's very vital, I think critical, to understand the need to have our people feel that they belong at the organization. And the sense of belonging comes around from feeling valued and cared for. And the technology that's available through various surveys and so on is a really interesting opportunity for us to really understand our people. When you think about Indigenous people, you think about Black community, you think about persons with disabilities and so on, and the LGBTQ2+. For example, it gets more complicated, right? Like, so we're not within one particular group, but as leaders, we have this huge diversity. Australia and Canada are both very diverse. Toronto is one of the most diverse cities in the world. So it's interesting when you think about LGBTQ2+, for example, many folks feel that they have what's called a chosen family. So for whatever reasons, there's not as much of a connection with your biological family. So during the pandemic, with restrictions and so on, you don't have that access to your chosen family, making you feel very isolated. So when you are not available at work, again, because of restrictions and so on, you're going to get a stronger sense. We're actually doing some research on this and testing and listening sessions, and we're finding out the story behind the story when it comes to engagement. We're segregating it, disaggregating by the various diversity groups and segments. And we're learning some really interesting things. At EDC, there's a real appetite, a real interest in understanding what makes our employees tick, what makes them feel valued and cared for, what makes them feel that they belong. And for me personally, throughout my career, I've always felt that when you're included and you feel cared for, this releases something I call discretionary effort. So if we have 2,000 employees approximately, and everybody can do just that little bit more, it's going to make us stronger as a team and allow us to better serve our customers. So, yep, focus on having our employees feel that they belong, and that is going to be a critical skill moving forward in the new normal.
That's a fascinating insight. So, I mean, the feeling of belonging, I haven't heard that being used before in the corporate sense. You hear about the social circles and your take, Stella, on this reciprocity. Again, I mean, these are not words that you would hear, I feel, in a work office setting, and to say that these are going to be key drivers, key skill sets to really hone in, foster, and deliver, whether you're managing a business, whether you're managing a team, or, in Andre's case, whether you're leading a government, down under. I think that's a really interesting thing to take on board. So I hope people hear that. I've from a personal perspective, I've made an individual choice of how I spend my money. I think with the Black Lives Matter movement that happened in the global, I should say, because it's been around, but the global and how it transversed the globe, and then it landed on Australian shores and caused some protests and some activity here. I would say, as a Black woman, I was affected, personally. And then you compound that being in a pandemic where we have uncertainty and we don't know what's going on with our jobs and our work. And then as an expat, you are separated from your family. I think a lot of people are probably having similar experiences where that's a lot to take on board all at once. So to have that resiliency, but also the feeling of belonging, and with your colleagues or with your business partners, that reciprocity, I think, will really come in. So I'd love to be able to sort of speak about what your organizations are doing, because I think there's some really exciting things happening there. I feel that both your organizations are very progressive. Richard, when you and I spoke, we started talking about employment equity, and you had some fascinating insights into what you're trying to achieve there at EDC. Would you like to share a bit about that concept for those that maybe aren't familiar with employment equity and what you're doing within your organization?
Okay, so employment equity, I'll just compress it, 1986, Judge Rosalie Abella started the Abella Commission in Canada, basically trying to figure out ways to engage the labor force of Canada, not using the affirmative action approach that was very common in the US, but something that was a bit less controversial. So employment equity, it's been 35 years, and we haven't had much results, actually. We have 4 designated groups. There's visible minority, persons with disabilities, Aboriginal people, and women. And of those 4 groups, as I said, we haven't had a lot of growth. So one thing that is very interesting, many companies and organizations in Canada, post George Floyd, the whole brutal murder of George Floyd that we all witnessed, and all of the awakening that came with that, companies started to realize maybe we're not doing enough. And when you group in Canada, we have this visible minority, non-Caucasian basically. So there's huge differences between Black people, people from Spain, people from India, Pakistan, and so on. So just to say visible minority, you're not really, you're not doing anyone any justice with that. So we recently started capturing this disaggregated for the visible minority. And so now we can see on our self-identification surveys and so on, who's who. And we can see also different sentiments in terms of the employee experience and, of course, representation numbers. We don't have quotas, we don't have specific targets, but we track our progress, and we're doing very well. We try to reach labor workforce availability. So let's say, for example, for visible minority or for Black in Canada, there may be, for example, 5%. So we strive to get 5% across all levels of the company, just as a benchmark. So actually, EDC is doing well. We're pretty well achieving or exceeding, but now we're getting into this disaggregated focus, as I was talking about, and doing 2 things: not only looking at representation, which is kind of old school. I think what's more important is understanding the sentiments of the various groups and getting the story behind the story. I'll share a very quick one, just for the interest of time. We discovered that our Latin employees, and we have employee resource groups associated with all of the various key, major populations. But the Latin group, we were so keen. Hey, why is it that the Latin employees are so strong when it comes to managing their mental health and so resilient, during these difficult times? Your score is considerably higher than the norm. And so we had to sit down. And they said, you know what? In the Latin culture, it's not only stigma, it's taboo to talk about having mental sort of weakness or anything like that. So probably people just said that everything's okay. So we get the story behind the story, and then we can share that with our leaders and say, hey, this is what the real story is. And we have similar information. We're dissecting all of these sentiments and then looking at specific targeted initiatives that are going to help, as I say, achieve this strong feeling of belonging.
That's really fascinating. I think it would be a great insight to organizations to look at their data like that, or to first of all capture the data and then make decisions based on that. But really, like you say, the disaggregated, really getting the story behind the story. I wonder if a lot of organizations do that, or if they just make sweeping judgments or assumptions or decisions really not based on facts, on that data that they're seeking from their workforce. So that's
Can I just jump in on that? Deloitte did a study, I think it was 2011, and for the US, the United States, Fortune 500, I believe it was, don't quote me, but I believe it was 28% of the Fortune 500 have at least one full-time equivalent. So it could be 2 people. Half their job is doing the diversity investment. Only 28% of Fortune 500. So another trend I'd like to mention is that so many companies now are hiring their diversity manager, their diversity specialist, whatever. And so that's another phenomena that's happening here. So I think progress is happening in Canada and around the world, that we're finally post this awakening. In Canada as well, we've had a very horrific story with respect to the children discovered first in Kamloops and then beyond. Across Canada, I think we're up to 4,118 children who died in residential schools who are documented, but there's now over, I think it's 1,300 in the first 9 schools that were investigated with radar. It's a radar that can detect, human remains and so on. So there's 139 residential schools, only 9 There's documented 1,300 children. So this is another horrible, horrible story that Canadians just don't understand. We don't really we didn't learn it in school. The younger children now are learning, the truth. And this Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada is, again, bringing us all together and focusing on the fact that we all have to live together harmoniously and that we all, deserve an opportunity to reach our full potential. So this is another major, major trend that I just wanted to call to our attention.
Yeah, that's really really saddening and very important. I think both trends that you mentioned are really important. Stella, did you have something that you'd want to jump in with insight?
Yeah, so just reflecting what Richard said and the similarities, I think, in reflecting and what your organisation is doing and what's happening across across Canada. We're equally seeing changes across Australia as well. So, through government procurement, there are now new diversity inclusion requirements and Indigenous employment requirements, and there's more of a focus, I guess, around procurement and business. At IBA, we obviously, as an organisation that supports Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, very much respect and promote diversity, but we don't just do it from the perspective of our customers and ourselves as Indigenous staff, but we have a diverse group of people that work within the organisation, and some from minority groups that have come across. And we see, and I see it, I guess, as an Aboriginal person, the challenges that I've seen my family and my mum and my grandparents, decades of this exclusion and systemic racism that's come through. We see it, in our migrant groups. It's this unfair treatment as well. And so there's so many common challenges and considerations. And within IBA, so we've actually got a diversity champion. We've got a diversity and inclusion statement or policy. We have an Indigenous engagement strategy and inclusion strategy that we review and work on, so that we make sure we get this well-balanced, engagement and development of our own First Nations people, and progression to, managerial positions as well, not just entry level, but from all backgrounds as well. It's really critically important. We, through our programs, we are looking at different demographics. We are able to share the inherent challenges that our women have, with cultural and community responsibilities in buying homes or in starting businesses. And so we have a Strong Women Strong Business network, and we provide business development support and access to finance for that group. And we've created this network of women that can support each other. We're focusing on our youth and that voice of the future, and thinking about, what cultural inclusion and what cultural inclusion in business, what's the cultural perspective or the want for youth for home ownership into the future. So we're bringing different voices to the table. And just additionally at IBA, we've, in the last 18 months created our own social impact framework, which is really important. IBA has been established for 30 years now, and whereas segments of us were established under CACC, which was a commission in the 70s and 80s. And what's important is the impact that we make. I think the work that our people do and the capital that and funding that we can allocate for this, being able to measure it and actually show what tangible change means to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to actually demonstrate the impact on financial confidence and financial resilience, on cultural resilience and cultural safety, and having, in communities, having that safe sense as well. It's really important to be able to measure and demonstrate, because it's really the change for the future. You can see, where we're making generational impact.
That's awesome. I think what I'm hearing, if I can quickly summarize, is having this engagement with the people that you're working with, business or employment or otherwise. So not making decisions just based on what you think. It's actually basing it on data, and, like you say, Richard, the story behind the story, really understanding that and taking the time. I think a lot of people might miss that step and not realizing that's a critical step. Stella, when we spoke, we talked about sustainability and sustainability on country, which I think is, if we take a step back, in the news lately, there's been all this climate change discussion and what have you, but if we bring that back to you know, the individual business owner, what does that mean? Or the consumer, what does that mean, sustainability? And you had some interesting examples of businesses that you're working with and how that's translating into the marketplace.
Yes, Mel. So creating ecosystems or circular economies on country and in communities. And so, you know, the Indigenous business sector, but more broadly the health sector and education sector has an increased focus over the last few years, about being able to keep people on country, people in communities, and be able to create and contribute to economies and lives and families actually on country. Australia is such a large space. You know, we have over 300 nations. Regional and remote locations can be really complex. We don't have the infrastructure and the resources, you know, to create jobs and get specialised skills and training, or even secondary education. In a lot of our remote locations, our kids have to go off to boarding school or head into, you know, major cities and towns, and it's a real disconnection from country. It's quite disempowering to a degree, and very foreign when you think a lot about, you know, community and regional people that really don't travel and understand. But there's more of a focus now in business on actually doing business on country and creating resources, and as I said, the ecosystem where products and services are being utilised to grow communities, and actually to increase skills and increase capabilities and to create jobs. And what we're seeing is that from a sustainable perspective, communities, businesses and Aboriginal organisations are looking at use of land and water and sea, and the aspirations of actually converting that into economic opportunity and jobs and business is really strengthening and growing. And we've got prescribed body corporates that generally have a native title success, or in the process of creating native title success, and they have land through allocation that, you know, there's a real desire to use for economic change and development.
And one of the examples that you gave, which I thought was fascinating, that one business who had a product from start to finish was using, everything was sustainable the whole way through. So it wasn't just about, recycling your water bottle, or, I mean, gosh, we probably should be using water bottles these days, but it was more than just one element. It was throughout the whole chain that they were doing it start to finish.
Yes, and I think that's trying to remember exactly what we're talking about next. We actually see so many examples of the establishment, creation of business on country, and it can be through creating products. So whether it's bush foods and bush products, the rehabilitation of land and harvesting. So there's a important cultural element and respect about how you harvest and how you use product. It actually creates manufacturing on companies. So, you know, there's some great businesses that are actually doing that and actually creating their products on country. They're getting people into jobs to actually do that as well. We're bringing resources in so they can learn to promote and market. And in turn, as that business grows, we see a more stabilised focus and contribution. So when money comes into community, there's more money focused on education, on health. We see in that cycle of economic, and I use the term often, empowerment, we see more programs at schools. So businesses are supporting breakfast programs, and they're supporting little entrepreneur programs at school and gardening programs, or, you know, helping the kids connect with the rangers and get them out on country as well. So it's actually bringing an income into community and actually recycling it, keeping it in there, and actually, you know, helping to grow young people right through into healthy, you know, educational environments and into healthy homes.
That's fantastic. I think, you know, and obviously we could talk about this forever, and I know we got a late start, so I don't want your whole day to go late. I'd like to finish with the concept of inclusive trade and what that means. And we were fortunate to have Andre come back to us. I might invite you into this conversation, Andre, if you wanted to give perhaps your perspective on inclusive trade and how we can ensure we have that moving forward.
Oh, well, thank you, Mel. You can hear me well?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, thank you. This is great. I was just.
Oh no, did we lose him?
Cool.
We lost video and audio. He's still on, but we can't hear or see you, Andre, if you can hear. But you know what? This is what this whole morning's been like. So from
New normal.
Yeah, the new normal.
It's a conspiracy.
Oh, there he is.
Andre, we can hear your voice.
There he's back.
Sorry about that. So let's not try to understand what happened here. Let's just carry on. So yes, inclusive trade. So as it happens, my previous job just before coming to Sydney was being the lead for the government of Canada on what we call our inclusive trade policy. So I had the responsibility of trying to develop the policy and implement it. And just in a nutshell, I mean, for the longest time, there was this perceived, understanding that international trade is gender, inclusivity neutral, and then we had to work so hard to fight that. Conceived notion that, if you had neutral rules, then you had no issues, because the reality is that, the barriers are often very invisible, and we didn't have the tool to really get to them. So part of the concept of inclusive trade from Canada and Australia has been a great supporter as well, has been to just break that understanding and notion that, if you have neutrality in your rules, trade agreements, and so on and so forth, therefore you are creating a level playing field. So our idea was, no, there are some invisible barriers. We have to invest more time and energy into trying to understand where they are. Therefore, then we can take action to overcome them. So we've been investing a lot into creating groups, whether Indigenous, Black minority, or women, to get a real sense of their experience. And then once we have that information, then we can start making action. So Canada, Australia, other countries have joined force and rank to create those cooperation and work together to try to overcome those barriers. So it's everything we do. So whether we do a special focused trade mission, which is one way of going about it, but there's also just creating those relationships and understanding those barriers. So a lot of work still remain to be done, because it's all about understanding the reality and then addressing it. But we are committed to, when we do trade agreements now, we Canada make sure that our negotiating teams go through a GBA plus analysis of every chapter, so that you just don't go and negotiate a trade provision like you used to. You actually wait, pause, and do the analysis of how is this provision in a trade agreement can have an impact on the various communities and underrepresented group that we're trying to support. So that has been our approach for the last, I would say, about three years, and we've had quite a good success in incorporating some of those concepts into our new trade agreement. So CPTPP, it used to be TPP, the Trade Pacific Partnership. It is now the Comprehensive and Progressive Trade Pacific Partnership, thanks to Canada, because it was to reflect the fact that we wanted to be more than just a trade agreement. We want it to be comprehensive and progressive here was getting at the idea of diversity and inclusiveness.
So simply put, for those that may not be familiar with the term inclusive trade, it is about having everyone, and we go back to what we kind of spoke about earlier, is economic participation at all levels, all minorities, all groups. So that's interesting about how you're shifting your focus and analysis to these agreements, because it does, you need the grassroots level, but then you also need the policy. It has to sort of marry up and come together. Richard, did you have any programs that you could highlight or any sort of initiatives that you think helps with that trend of inclusivity?
Sure. So if we go from the macro that Andre was just talking about, in July 2021, this year, EDC announced its Inclusive Trade Investment Program, the ITIP, which commits $200 million in equity support for businesses owned and led by Indigenous peoples, Black community, women, persons with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+. So that was a big initiative. We also, as I mentioned, focusing on Black community, have recently created a roadshow in collaboration with Business Development Bank Canada, BDC, and also Trade Commissioner Services, TCS, partnering with Black businesses, serving organizations to raise awareness about the different services and offerings, that can be accessed. So that education piece is important. I do want to share the story of Baffin Fisheries. Baffin Fisheries recently finalized the building of Canada's largest fishing vessel. It's 80 meters long. It's designed in Norway and built in Turkey by the Tersan shipyard. The capacity of this vessel is for 1.8 million pounds of shrimp. That's pristine, cold water shrimp. That's a lot of shrimp on the Barbie. A lot. Scotiabank led the incremental financing of up to $60 million towards the $72 million acquisition, and included and this included direct lending from EDC. So the vessel reduces carbon footprint. It provides greater returns to shareholders and has capacity for expansion. So that's a great Inuit-owned business, and again, it demonstrates the full idea of inclusive trade and how we're very proud of what is underway and more to follow. That's exciting.
That's really exciting. And that, the shrimp on the Barbie, I hear that all the time. That's a common thing about Australia. People, I think about us. Stella, did you have anything that, you have some really interesting things going on in your organization. So probably hard to choose which one to mention.
Yes, so I did mention our women's initiative and our youth initiative as well, but we also, through our investments program, mentioned a bit earlier, so we do equity investment in commercial assets with traditional owner groups. And so we have a tourism portfolio and a retail portfolio, and our view is to work closely and build capacity with Aboriginal traditional owners that we are partnering with. So we have, collective boards as you would with a normal company and shareholding structure. Our view is always, and depends on the term and the capacity in which that we can support and grow the organisations. But for us, it's always a transition or intent to transition the asset through purchase over to the traditional owners, so they are the sole owners of that. But we have a focus in renewable energies at the moment as well, and looking at infrastructure and talking about, again, on-country and in-country investment, and working with the traditional owner groups there, and management firms there, really create that inclusive, it's quite a sophisticated environment when you think about investment, because it's investing in large assets, and we actually do have 2 investment funds through a property and normal sort of cash investment fund where we invest IBO's own capital as well. And so it's actually bringing and supporting Aboriginal traditional owners, into that mainstream investment market and thinking and understanding and education of and building financial capacity in that space. So that's really important when we talk about inclusivity. But also we work closely with, so there's quite a few Indigenous chambers of commerce. There are Indigenous business networks, and there are some business hubs that have been established that provide this on the ground capability development support. Some of them have trade programs and export programs, and they're really there as a resource to create the economy also within a specific state and territory, and to build those resources for Aboriginal businesses as well.
That's an interesting perspective when you mention about the investment side, that sometimes people don't think about that. I mean, it does, we need everything, policy, investment, grassroots. I mean, look, I love, all the sort of concepts we've introduced today, the trends, the insights. I think hopefully that can help anybody who's listening. We'll obviously send out some more information about all this so people can click through to do their own research and hopefully maybe even reach out to you directly. And I'd love to spend more time on it, but I don't want to keep you about your day or night from Richard's perspective. So I wanted to ask just a closing thought. Is there anything that you would like to leave people with, food for thought, insight, advice, around, leading through this pandemic, essentially?
I think, Mel, for Aboriginal businesses, back yourself. You know your markets, you know your sectors. Often when we look at procurement, and particularly with government and within Australia, we have a federal procurement policy. There's not actually the conversation about what is, why buy from an Aboriginal business, and it's not necessarily about a label. It's the inherent understanding of land and country. It's the way that products and services are delivered, and it's the long-term impact and change that's created for Aboriginal people and communities through that procurement and that development. And often we see it in, building not just personal wealth and assets, but jobs and employment. And jobs and employment means retention in jobs and long-term employment as well. So, back yourself, you know your markets, but also, more broadly, we always promote support by Black, and we have these great brands now within Australia, and we're seeing the fashion industry just skyrocket. This week's Melbourne Fashion Week, and we have, there's about 6 Indigenous fashion businesses that I know popping up all over Melbourne in Federation Square. So, it's really, the products are diverse, they're quality, they're sustainable, and again, that long-term impact, I really, can't recommend enough. Go out and look for Aboriginal businesses.
By Black, absolutely.
By Black.
Yes. Richard, any closing thoughts you'd like to leave with everybody?
Sure. So equity-seeking people are resilient. It's just part of our life. And I think for leaders who are looking during this pandemic and beyond, remember the impact of being transparent with your people. I think data-driven strategies is really, really an important way to go moving forward. And I think most of all, servant leadership with our employee resource groups. Many organizations have employees who are working from the side of their desk, putting in the extra time, extra hours. And if we can serve them as they do their best to help create safer and more inclusive environments at work, it's going to be a win-win, not only for our employees, for the organization, but most importantly, I think for our customers as well. So those would be my last thoughts. We are investigating an online mentoring program, which is another piece that's very important. Always think about the technology. Because of this idea, back to what Stella said about the importance of being connected, we're getting tired. We have a certain energy that comes with being connected. We all do. So having an online technology where you can do mentoring, sponsorship, and coaching, I think is going to be the next frontier, and we're looking at it very closely.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. Well, I want to thank Francois Geru, the Consul General for Canada in Sydney. I want to thank Josh Riley, the Consul General for Australia in Toronto. Of course, Richard in Ottawa and Stella in Canberra. Thank you so much for taking the time out to talk about this. And I hope that you'll able to speak at one of our next events, because I just feel like we only scratched the surface. And I think there is a lot more to talk about this important issue and topic. And hopefully we can have you back next year. So thanks so much. Be safe, and we'll end it there.
Thanks,
Keep up the great work, Stella.
Thank you to Richard. Hope to meet you soon.